The 19th century was a time of extraordinary change for Britain, as Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837. A great transformation was already underway. The Industrial Revolution, arguably the most significant turning point in modern history, was reshaping every corner of the nation, and nowhere felt its impact more than London. The city, already ancient and complex, suddenly became the heart of a global empire and the engine of modern capitalism. But behind the curtain of progress and power, the reality for much of its population was grim, uncertain, and brutally unforgiving. London in the early Victorian period was a city in flux. From the elegant avenues of Mayfair to the soot-covered slums of Whitechapel, the population was exploding. In 1801, there were just under 1 million people living in the city. By the turn of the 20th century, that number had swelled to over 6.5 million. That scale of growth is difficult to fathom. It was as if the city was expanding by the minute, swallowing entire villages, farms, and open fields, replacing them with row after row of brick housing, factories, foundries, and warehouses. This population surge wasn't organic. It was driven by desperation. In the countryside, agricultural workers were being displaced en masse by mechanization. Traditional craftspeople were losing out to mass production. Famine, especially the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, sent waves of impoverished people into England in search of survival. For many, London represented hope. There was work here, work in the docks, in the textile mills, in the ironworks, in construction. There were rumors of money to be made, food to be eaten, a better life to be claimed. The image of the capital sparkled in their minds as a place where, if you were willing to work hard enough, you could find your fortune. But when they arrived, most were met not with opportunity, but with hardship. The jobs were real, but they were also inconsistent, low-paid, and back-breaking. Day laborers stood for hours at hiring gates each morning, hoping to be chosen for work that would pay just enough to get them a meal or a place to sleep that night. Women, if they were lucky, found positions as seamstresses or servants, but more often ended up in the brutal world of laundries or in prostitution. Children, too, joined the workforce in droves, often starting as young as 5 or 6, sorting coal, working dangerous machinery, or selling cheap goods on the street. For many, housing was the next immediate crisis. With so many people arriving so quickly, there simply wasn't enough room to accommodate them. Landlords, many of them speculative investors, saw an opportunity in the chaos. They divided existing buildings into smaller and smaller units, sometimes housing multiple families in a single room. Others built cheaply and quickly, with little concern for sanitation, safety, or stability. These buildings, often referred to as tenements, were overcrowded to an unimaginable degree. A single room might house a couple with several children, a widowed mother, and perhaps a boarder or two paying for a mattress in the corner. Privacy was non-existent, so was cleanliness. With no indoor plumbing, residents used shared outdoor privies, which overflowed and leaked into the streets. Water sources were frequently contaminated. Rats and lice were constant companions. The smell, according to contemporary accounts, was overwhelming. Disease thrived in these conditions. Outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis swept through neighborhoods with terrifying regularity. Infants and the elderly were especially vulnerable, but no one was truly safe. These slums weren't hidden away in some forgotten corner of the city. They were right next to wealthy neighborhoods, often just a few streets apart from fine townhouses and bustling shopping arcades. The contrast was jarring. A banker might step out of his grand home, climb into a polished carriage, and within minutes be passing starving children with hollow eyes, barefoot women in ragged shawls, and the dying curled up in alleyways. For many of London's elite, This juxtaposition was invisible. They turned their faces away. They described the poor as lazy, morally weak, or inherently inferior. The Victorian mind was often obsessed with categorization, and poverty was framed not as a social failure, but as a personal one. As more people fell through the cracks, homelessness became a defining feature of life in industrial London. Some were evicted from their slum lodgings for failing to pay rent. Others never managed to secure housing in the first place. With no safety net, no government programs, and very few charitable options, the street became their only refuge. Men slept under bridges or on the steps of churches. Women tried to find shelter in abandoned buildings or coal yards. Children huddled together in doorways, trying to stay warm through the freezing London nights. The reasons for homelessness were many. A lost job, an injury, the death of a breadwinner. Any of these could send a working-class family spiraling into ruin. Wages were often just barely enough to cover rent and food. There was no room for error, no cushion to fall back on. Illness, especially for manual laborers, was a death sentence, not just for the body, but for the household. An injured man couldn't work. A sick mother couldn't care for her children. The dominoes fell quickly. The daily routine of the homeless was a grim cycle of survival. By day, they scavenged for food, rummaging through refuse, begging on street corners, or stealing what they could. Many picked through rubbish heaps looking for scraps to sell: old bones, bits of metal, cloth, anything that might earn a few pence. By night, they sought shelter from the cold. Some curled up under tarpaulins in dark alleyways. Others attempted to gain entry to one of the city's grim workhouses or casual wards, but these were limited and the rules were strict. Those admitted were often subjected to humiliating conditions and long hours of menial labor. Many chose the street over the degradation. Despite all this, the city continued to grow. Factories multiplied. Rail lines crisscrossed the capital. The skyline rose with chimneys, spires, and domes. London became the seat of empire, the financial capital of the world, the heart of global trade and innovation. But underneath the glittering surface, the poor carried the burden of that success on their bent backs and blistered feet. This duality was deeply embedded in Victorian life, the celebration of progress, science, and morality on one side, and the casual tolerance of human suffering on the other. The government was slow to act, hamstrung by ideology. The dominant philosophy of the time, laissez-faire economics, held that the state should not interfere with the market. Poverty was seen as a natural part of society, even necessary to encourage discipline and morality among the working classes. Charity was encouraged, but only when it promoted moral improvement. Many institutions would only offer aid if the recipient was deemed sufficiently virtuous, obedient, hard-working. Those who failed to meet these criteria were often dismissed as hopeless or dangerous. This moralistic approach did little to address the systemic causes of poverty and homelessness, and it left many in perpetual despair. Writers and journalists began to take notice. Social investigators like Henry Mayhew documented the lives of London's poor in excruciating detail. His multi-volume work, London Labour and the London Poor, painted a vivid picture of hawkers, beggars, costermongers, and street children. He gave statistics, yes, but more importantly, he gave voice to those who had none. Through interviews and first-hand observations, he showed that the homeless and destitute were not criminals or degenerates. They were victims of an economy and society that had left them behind. Charles Dickens, perhaps the most famous chronicler of Victorian life, used fiction to shine a spotlight on these realities in books like Oliver Twist, Bleak House, and Hard Times. He portrayed the cruelty of the workhouse, the corruption of institutions, and the quiet heroism of those struggling to survive. His characters, orphans, widows, factory workers, reflected the lives of real people, and his writing stirred the conscience of the middle classes. And yet change came slowly. For much of the Victorian era, homelessness remained a persistent, visible, and largely ignored part of London's landscape. Only toward the end of the century did real reforms begin to take shape. Public health acts attempted to improve sanitation. Housing regulations sought to limit overcrowding. Charitable organizations pushed for more humane shelters and aid programs. But for many who had lived and died on the streets, these reforms came far too late. The story of homelessness in Victorian London is not just a tale of misery. It's a lens through which we can understand the contradictions of a rapidly modernizing world. It reveals how a society can produce incredible wealth and innovation while simultaneously allowing masses of its citizens to suffer and perish in silence. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about progress, responsibility, and the meaning of compassion. Because while the past may be behind us, the questions it raises still linger, and the streets of London, then and now, still carry the echoes of those who had nowhere else to go. To walk through the streets of Victorian London as a member of the working poor was to exist in a world that teetered constantly on the edge of collapse. For many, life was not about living but about surviving. 1 hour, 1 day, one freezing night at a time. There was no room for dreams or ambitions. There was only the grind of poverty, the gnawing fear of destitution, and the constant threat of becoming one of the city's invisible, the homeless, the forgotten, the discarded. The daily life of London's poor was dictated by forces entirely out of their control. Industrialization had created a new kind of city, larger, louder, and less forgiving than anything before it. As thousands flocked to London in search of employment and escape from rural hardship, the population density skyrocketed. The capital became a chaotic patchwork of grandeur and grime. While the wealthy sipped tea in high-ceilinged drawing rooms and browsed luxury goods in department stores, just streets away, men, women, and children were crammed into slum dwellings with little more than a straw mattress on a floor of cold, damp stone. Inside these crumbling tenements, life was harsh beyond imagination. Buildings designed for one family might house 4 or 5, sometimes more, with each person paying rent for a corner of a room, a blanket, or even just a place on the floor. The poorest lived in cellar flats, below street level, where cold air and sewage seeped in through cracks in the bricks. The smell was omnipresent, the mingling stench of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, urine, human waste, and the soot that blanketed the city from its countless chimneys. There was no privacy, no security, no escape from the noise or the suffering. For the lucky ones, there might be a shared toilet at the end of the street, a filthy, overflowing cesspool used by dozens of tenants. More often, waste was simply dumped into gutters, mixed with animal droppings, and left to run along the street with the rain. Contaminated drinking water was commonplace, leading to deadly outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. These illnesses struck indiscriminately, but were particularly lethal to infants and the elderly. In some of the poorest districts, 1 in 3 children would not survive past their 5th birthday. The meager diet of the working poor only made things worse. Bread, potatoes, and weak tea formed the basis of most meals. Meat was a rare luxury. Fresh vegetables were too expensive for many families to buy regularly, and dairy products were often diluted or spoiled. Malnutrition was not just a condition, it was a way of life. Children grew up stunted and frail. Women suffered miscarriages or gave birth to babies too weak to live more than a few weeks. Men, expected to labor for 10 or 12 hours a day, struggled to maintain the strength to endure physically demanding jobs, and yet, despite these conditions, work was non-negotiable. Idleness was a death sentence. Even the young were expected to contribute. Children might start working by the age of 6 or 7, sweeping chimneys, delivering goods, selling matches or water on the street, or helping their mothers in laundries and workshops. The labor was hard and often dangerous, and schooling was a rare privilege. Education reform laws slowly emerged over the century, but enforcement was weak, and poverty forced most families to choose between sending their children to school or feeding them. For women, life was especially precarious. Many found work as domestic servants, but these jobs came with long hours, constant surveillance, and the risk of exploitation or abuse. Others worked in factories or did piecework at home, sewing garments or assembling goods for pennies a day. Widows, single mothers, and abandoned wives were especially vulnerable. Without a male breadwinner, they were often pushed to the very margins of society. For some, prostitution became the only means of survival. It was not a choice but a consequence. Victorian moralists spoke of fallen women and loose virtue, but rarely did they ask why a woman might turn to such a life, what desperation or hunger drove her to it. There was no safety net for those who fell ill or suffered injury. The only hope lay in the charity of others, churches, private philanthropists, or mutual aid societies, but charity came with strings attached. Donors often insisted on proof of moral worthiness, sobriety, piety, cleanliness, and humility. Those who failed to meet these standards were considered undeserving. In this way, even kindness was conditional, filtered through the moral judgments of the privileged. The fear of homelessness loomed constantly. Many lived on the edge of eviction. Lodgings were rented by the night or the week, and missing even a single payment could result in being thrown out with no legal recourse. Families often moved from one slum to another, carrying their few belongings in bundles, searching for somewhere marginally less awful. Those who found themselves without any shelter had few options. They could sleep in stables, under market stalls, or in doorways. In the winter months, this was a death sentence for many. The cold took children first, followed by the elderly. The city's morgues overflowed each year with the anonymous bodies of the poor. And yet, amid all this suffering, there was community. There were moments of solidarity and strength. In the darkest corners of the city, people still helped one another. Neighbors shared food when they could. Mothers watched each other's children. Workers formed associations and unions. There was laughter, music, even joy. However fleeting, the resilience of the human spirit burned quietly, like a candle in the fog. Still, the system was not designed to support the poor. It was designed to use them. Employers knew there were always more bodies to take the place of the sick, the injured, or the dead. Wages were kept as low as possible. Safety regulations were non-existent. If a worker lost a limb in a machine, there was no compensation, only a quiet dismissal and the hope that someone else would take him in. If a woman died in childbirth, her children were often taken to orphanages or the streets. Society judged the poor harshly. Popular literature and newspapers often portrayed them as lazy, criminal, or morally corrupt. The idea that poverty was the result of bad choices rather than structural inequality was deeply embedded in Victorian thought. Even reformers and philanthropists sometimes adopted a paternalistic tone, treating the poor as wayward children to be corrected rather than as people to be empowered. And yet, many of those who lived on the edge were once just like anyone else. Skilled tradesmen who lost work to machines, farmers displaced by land enclosures, immigrants fleeing famine or war, widows left with mouths to feed and no means to do so. Life could change in an instant. A single misfortune, a death, a fire, an illness, could unravel everything. Those who lived this reality rarely had the luxury of writing their own histories. Their stories were not recorded in family journals or carefully preserved letters. They were not given monuments or statues, but their presence shaped the very fabric of the city. They laid the bricks, cleaned the homes, stitched the clothes, and loaded the ships. Without them, the Victorian success story could not have been written. Writers like Henry Mayhew tried to capture these lives. In his journalistic accounts, he described in painstaking detail the daily routines of the city's poorest workers, the bone pickers, the mudlarks, the flower sellers, the crossing sweepers. His interviews revealed not only the economic hardships they faced, but also the complexity of their lives, their aspirations, their dignity. Mayhew saw the humanity in those whom society had cast aside. Charles Dickens, too, refused to let the world ignore the suffering of the poor. Through his novels, he brought their lives into the drawing rooms of the middle class. He gave names and faces to those who had been reduced to statistics. He made their stories compelling, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore. His characters were fictional, but their pain was real. In response to this growing awareness, some began to demand change. Reformers called for better housing, cleaner streets, and public health measures. There were campaigns to provide clean drinking water, build sewer systems, and regulate housing standards. But progress was slow and piecemeal. For much of the century, the poor were left to fend for themselves, their lives hanging in the balance each and every day. Living on the edge in Victorian London was not a rare condition. It was the norm for millions. These people were not lazy or foolish. They were victims of a society that prioritized profit over people, reputation over reality. They struggled not because they lacked will or character, but because the world around them offered no stable ground to stand on. The edge was not just physical. It was psychological. The anxiety of not knowing where the next meal would come from, the shame of begging for help, the trauma of losing a child to hunger or cold. These were emotional wounds that never healed. They left scars not only on individuals, but on entire generations. And yet, even in the face of such adversity, people endured. They found ways to hold on, through love, through friendship, through the smallest of victories, a hot cup of tea shared on a bitter night, a child's laughter echoing in a crumbling alleyway, a mother's quiet lullaby sung to a baby she hoped would live to see another morning. Life on the edge in Victorian London was brutal and relentless. But within that life existed something that no amount of hardship could fully extinguish, the persistence of hope, fragile, trembling, sometimes foolish, but they're all the same. And perhaps in the end it was hope that kept them walking through the fog, one step, one breath, one day at a time. In the heart of 19th century Britain, while steam trains roared and chimneys bled smoke into the sky, another, less visible engine of the empire rumbled behind tall walls and iron gates. It was called the Workhouse, a place spoken of in hushed tones, feared by the poor, misunderstood by the comfortable, and reviled by many who experienced it firsthand. The workhouse was not just a building. It was an idea, a threat, and a weapon disguised as compassion. It was the final destination for thousands of men, women, and children who had nowhere else to go when the fragile threads of survival snapped. The workhouse system was born out of legislations, specifically the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This law, passed by Parliament, was designed to reform the way the state supported the poor. The thinking behind it was rooted in a cold kind of rationalism. Lawmakers, heavily influenced by utilitarian philosophy and an obsession with thrift, believed that existing relief systems, where money or food was given to the poor in their own homes, were too generous, too soft. They claimed this outdoor relief encouraged laziness and dependency, that it disincentivized work and drained national resources. The solution, a deterrent so severe, so soul-crushing, that only those in absolute desperation would choose it. That deterrent was the workhouse. On paper, it sounded efficient. Each parish or union of parishes would run a workhouse. The able-bodied poor, if they could not support themselves or find employment, would be given food and shelter in exchange for labor. They would be clothed and fed, and their basic needs met. But in practice, the workhouse was designed not to help, but to punish. Its conditions were deliberately harsh, so unpleasant, so humiliating, that the very idea of entering one would strike fear into the hearts of the working class. It was intended to distinguish the deserving poor from the undeserving, a line drawn not by compassion, but by cruelty. For those forced by circumstances to enter, the workhouse was a brutal awakening. Upon arrival, families were immediately separated. This was one of the defining cruelties of the system. A mother, father, and their children might have clung to one another through months of hunger and hardship on the streets, but the moment they crossed the threshold of the workhouse, they were torn apart. Husbands were sent to the men's ward, wives to the women's, children divided by age and gender. They might not see each other again for weeks, months, or ever. For the administrators, this policy was justified. After all, the workhouse was not a home, but an institution. For those who endured it, it was a wrenching agony that added emotional trauma to their already unbearable lives. Inside, daily life was stripped of dignity and choice. Uniforms were issued, drab, itchy clothing that erased identity and individuality. Hair was cut, names were sometimes replaced with numbers, personal belongings were confiscated, silence was enforced. The architecture of the buildings reflected the ideology that shaped them. Bare walls, hard benches, long corridors, and high windows that let in light but gave no view of the world outside. Everything was built for surveillance, order, and control. There was no privacy, no softness, and no comfort. You were meant to feel that you were under constant watch, because you were. The labor required in exchange for food and shelter was often hard and pointless. Men were made to break stones into gravel, often in freezing yards for hours at a time with little rest. Others picked oakum, a tedious, finger-numbing task where old ropes were unraveled into threads for ship caulking. The work was repetitive and exhausting, designed not for productivity, but for punishment. It didn't matter whether the labor benefited anyone. The point was to grind down the spirit, to make the pauper work for his bread in the most degrading way possible. Women and children were not spared. Women often worked in laundries, bending over steaming vats of water, scrubbing endlessly. Others cleaned the same halls they slept in, scrubbed floors, washed linen, or prepared food for other inmates. Children might assist in cleaning, carry messages, or help in the kitchens, depending on their age. Their schooling was minimal, just enough to read, write, and calculate, with the goal of shaping them into future workers, not thinkers. The food provided was bland and repetitive. Meals were designed to meet the bare minimum for survival, not for health, and certainly not for enjoyment. Breakfast might be a bowl of watery gruel. Lunch could be a piece of bread and cheese. Occasionally, there might be boiled meat and potatoes, but portions were small and tightly rationed. Meals were eaten in silence under the watchful eyes of staff, often in long dining halls where every scrape of a spoon echoed like a judgment. To ask for more was to invite punishment. Punishment was, in fact, a regular feature of life inside. Inmates who broke rules, whether by speaking out of turn, refusing to work, or behaving improperly, were subjected to various disciplinary measures. These ranged from solitary confinement to reduced rations or hard labor. Some workhouses even had cells where offenders could be locked away. The rules were strict, and enforcement often arbitrary. Power rested in the hands of overseers and masters who were not always fair or kind. Abuse, though not always documented, was far from rare. Reports exist of beatings, verbal harassment, and neglect. The elderly fared especially poorly in the workhouse. Many had spent their lives in service, labor, or factory work, only to find themselves destitute in old age. Pensions did not exist. Their bodies, broken by decades of toil, were no longer useful to the capitalist machine, and so they were discarded, shuffled into workhouses where they were treated not as citizens who had contributed to society, but as burdens. They slept on hard beds, often without proper medical care, and many died quietly, their passing unmarked and unmourned by the world outside. Infants and the mentally ill were also admitted. While some workhouses had infirmaries or wards for special cases, these were often underfunded and understaffed. Mental illness was poorly understood, and patients were more likely to be restrained than treated. Mothers who gave birth in the workhouse did so under harsh conditions, often alone or with minimal assistance. Their children, born into institutional life, had little hope for a better future. The psychological toll of the workhouse cannot be overstated. To be admitted was to be publicly marked as a failure, an outcast. Paupers were looked down upon even by the working poor, who lived in terror of becoming one themselves. The system was intentionally degrading, stripping people of their autonomy, their pride, and their hope. It wasn't just that the workhouse was unpleasant. It was that it was constructed to feel like a form of punishment for the crime of being poor, and yet, despite all of this, people continued to enter them, not because they wanted to, but because there was no other choice. When landlords evicted tenants without notice, when factory work dried up, when illness drained a household of its last income, the workhouse was the only institution that would take them in. Charitable housing was scarce. Family members might already be struggling. The streets were dangerous, especially for women and children, so they entered, even knowing what awaited them. Over time, some reformers began to push back against the brutality of the system. Scandals occasionally erupted when the public learned of particularly horrific incidents such as starvation deaths, abuse by staff, or the mistreatment of children. These stories would be published in newspapers, provoking public outcry and parliamentary debate. In response, small changes were made. Some workhouses added infirmaries, others allowed families to communicate more freely, but these were surface-level improvements. The core of the system, the idea that poverty should be punished, remained intact for most of the century. Charles Dickens, perhaps more than anyone else, brought the reality of the workhouse into public consciousness. In Oliver Twist, he introduced readers to the image of the small boy, bowl in hand, asking for more. It was a scene that horrified Victorian audiences, not because they didn't believe it could happen, but because it showed them a mirror. Dickens understood that institutions built on cruelty could not claim moral authority. Through his writing, he made the workhouse not just a place of suffering, but a symbol of a society that had lost its soul. Despite their grim reputation, workhouses endured until the early 20th century. Some evolved into hospitals or care homes. Others were simply shut down. It wasn't until the emergence of the modern welfare state after World War II that the last remnants of the workhouse system were dismantled. By then, the phrase itself had become a byword for institutional cruelty, but the legacy of the workhouse lives on. It is a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when society treats poverty as a moral failing rather than a social condition. It shows us the danger of systems that prioritize deterrence over dignity, control over care. The workhouse was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate construction shaped by ideology, economics, and fear. It was the logical endpoint of a world view that valued productivity over people. For those who lived through it, the workhouse was not merely a building. It was a place where hope went to die, a place where the vulnerable were punished for their vulnerability. And yet, it is also a place we must remember, so that we never return to its cold iron embrace. In the bitter heart of Victorian London, when the workhouses filled to capacity or the pride of the poor kept them away from its iron gates, the only remaining choices were the streets or charity. For thousands each night, the two became one and the same. A stone bench became a bed, a church step a pillow, a hand extended in pity or in judgment might be the only lifeline between one more day of life and an anonymous death under the choking fog of the city. And so the poor, the desperate, the worn, down and the broken shuffled through London's alleys and lanes in search of something, anything, that might save them from another night sleeping in the open. While the workhouse was state-run, charity was deeply embedded in the private conscience of the Victorian age. Christian duty played a major role in how people viewed the poor. For the well-off, giving to the needy was seen not only as a virtue, but as a kind of spiritual necessity, a way to prove their own moral uprightness, to soothe their conscience while living amid appalling inequality. But Victorian charity was almost never unconditional. The idea that the poor could simply be fed, clothed, or sheltered without judgment or qualification was rare, even radical. Assistance came with strings. It was not about justice, it was about deservingness. The concept of the deserving poor was central to Victorian morality. The deserving poor were the respectable widow, the honest workman injured on the job, the orphan abandoned through no fault of their own. These were the people charity might help, so long as they were sober, humble, and grateful. The undeserving poor, however, were those who drank, swore, begged, or simply didn't appear to be trying hard enough. To many, in Victorian society, poverty was not just a condition, it was a reflection of character. And so, the charitable institutions of the time were built as much to correct the poor as to help them. Churches were at the heart of many charitable efforts. Christian missions, particularly in the East End of London, set up soup kitchens, clothing banks, and shelters. Some offered Bible lessons, others insisted on Sunday attendance. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, became one of the most visible and influential charitable groups of the era. It provided food, shelter, and spiritual guidance to tens of thousands, often focusing on rescuing women from prostitution and men from alcoholism. But even the Salvation Army, for all its compassion, required conversion, or at least the appearance of it. A sermon often preceded the soup. Then there were the ragged schools, offering basic education to the poorest children. These were not just classrooms, but lifelines for street kids who might otherwise never learn to read or write. Many were funded by individual donors or religious groups, and most were operated with very limited resources. These schools taught discipline, morality, scripture, and occasionally arithmetic. They provided clothing, shoes, a meal, and a bit of structure to children whose lives were otherwise chaotic. And yet, even here, judgment lurked. Teachers and volunteers often viewed the children as morally deficient, tainted by their surroundings, their parents, or their birth. A child raised in a brothel or a lodging house was seen as a future criminal unless corrected by moral instruction. But even with all these efforts, there were far more poor than there were resources to help them. Not every church had a shelter. Not every neighborhood had a mission. Not every donor had the stomach for true need. So the desperate turned to a grim alternative, the casual ward. Casual wards were the most basic, bare, bones form of state-supported shelter, often attached to the workhouses but open to non-inmates for a single night. They were technically part of the poor law system, but served a different function. These were places for the truly destitute, those who had no money, no roof, no plan. A man who had walked the streets all day in ragged boots, unable to find work or food, might finally stagger to the gates of the local workhouse and ask for a place in the casual ward. If there was space, he would be admitted, not to warmth or comfort, but to cold charity. Entry into the casual ward was not simple. Applicants had to register, give their names, and sometimes explain their circumstances. They were often treated as criminals or liars, assumed to be lazy until proven otherwise. Some wards required the poor to wait in long lines, sometimes overnight, just to be considered. Others issued tokens earlier in the date, tokens which were often bought and sold on the black market. The process was designed to discourage habitual use. It was a stopgap, not a solution. Once admitted, the casual would be given a small meal, perhaps bread and gruel, and a place to sleep. This was usually a wooden plank, a bare stone floor, or a hard bench. Some wards provided blankets, others did not. Heat was a luxury. Sanitation was minimal. Men were often housed separately from women and children, and conditions were uniformly bleak. The smell of sweat, dirt, and illness hung in the air. There was no privacy. Coughing, crying, groaning, all were heard in the darkness as dozens of broken people tried to rest their aching bodies. In exchange for this miserable shelter, labor was demanded. The next morning, before being allowed to leave, casuals were assigned tasks: stone, breaking, wood, chopping, yard sweeping. The logic was clear. No one would be allowed to abuse the system. You wanted a night indoors? You would pay for it with sweat and strain, but the labor was often arbitrary and meaningless. The stone broken by one man might be piled back together by another the next day. It wasn't about production. It was about deterrence. For women, the situation was even more precarious. Some casual wards refused to admit unaccompanied women, especially young ones, fearing prostitution or scandal. Others allowed mothers with children, but separated them once inside. Pregnant women were treated with suspicion. If a woman gave birth in a casual ward, she might find her newborn taken away and placed in an institution. Many women chose to sleep rough rather than risk this fate. The streets, for all their danger, at least gave them some measure of control, and the streets were dangerous. Night in London was cold, damp, and cruel. The fog that rolled in from the Thames seemed to thicken around the poor, pressing down like a shroud. Street lights flickered weakly, rats scurried in the gutters, gangs patrolled the alleys, preying on the vulnerable. For women and children, sexual violence was a constant threat. For men, it was assault or robbery. The police were few and far between, and not often friendly to the destitute. To sleep in the open was to risk arrest, exposure, or worse. Some found refuge in the penny seat, cheap shelters where, for the cost of a penny, one could sit on a bench overnight. Sleeping was discouraged, but many did so anyway, heads on chests, arms wrapped tightly around themselves for warmth. Others might pay 2 pennies for a penny hang, where a rope stretched across the room allowed guests to lean forward and sleep hanging over it. It was a grotesque kind of rest, but better than the ground. These shelters were privately run, overcrowded, and unsanitary, but for many, they were the only realistic option. Winter was the great killer. When temperatures dropped, deaths soared. Bodies were found each morning in doorways, under bridges, curled in stairwells. Newspapers sometimes reported these deaths, usually in cold, clinical tones. A woman of no fixed address was found deceased near Covent Garden. An unknown male, estimated age 50, succumbed to exposure. No names, no stories, no mourning, just statistics in a ledger of social failure. And yet, the poor endured. They developed networks, friendships, loyalties. Information passed between them: where to find a meal, which mission was kind, which casual ward had the least cruel overseers. Kindness still existed, Some shopkeepers quietly left scraps for the hungry. Some priests gave blankets or shoes. Some Londoners, even amid their own hardship, spared a few coins for someone in worse condition. Solidarity bloomed like weeds in the cracks of despair. Still, none of it was enough to stem the tide of suffering. Victorian London, for all its industry, invention, and intellect, failed to care for its most vulnerable. It outsourced compassion to religious institutions, privatized pity, and wrapped charity in chains of moral superiority. It demanded that the poor prove their worthiness again and again, even as it offered them nothing to work with. It viewed poverty not as a symptom of economic and social forces, but as a personal defect to be corrected through humiliation. The voices of the poor were rarely heard. Their pain was often filtered through the pens of middle-class journalists or the sermons of well-meaning clergymen, but occasionally their words broke through. Some left behind testimonies, scrawled in journals, published in pamphlets, or recounted to social reformers like Henry Mayhew. These voices spoke of the exhaustion, the degradation, the constant calculation of how to survive one more day with nothing. They did not speak of laziness or vice. They spoke of cold, of hunger, of fear. They asked not for pity, but for justice. By the late 19th century, some progress had been made. Reforms slowly began to reshape housing laws, public health, and education. Charitable organizations began to shift from moral policing to genuine assistance. Casual wards began to close or reform, but for the vast majority who lived through it, these changes came too late. Their lives had already been spent on the streets, in the shelters, in the wards and alleyways of a city that barely noticed their suffering. To understand charity in Victorian London is to understand its limits. It was an expression of conscience, yes, but also of control. It alleviated symptoms while ignoring causes. It taught the poor to beg for grace while expecting them to suffer with gratitude. It fed them just enough to survive, but never enough to escape. It placed moral judgment above material need, and it built a culture where compassion was rationed, one bowl of soup at a time, and so, each night, they came, shivering, barefoot, bruised. They came to the casual wards, to the missions, to the stone streets of a city whose wealth rested on their backs. They came seeking mercy in a world that too often offered only shame, and they came with a simple, silent hope that tomorrow might not be the same. In the grand tapestry of Victorian London, progress glowed brightest in marble halls and steam-powered factories, while shadows deepened in the cobblestone streets below. The city pulsed with innovation and promise, yet beneath the surface, millions struggled in silence. Society, in all its moral confidence and fervor, often turned a blind eye to their suffering. To understand how it could do so, one must look not only at poverty, but also at the values that shaped how people understood and misunderstood those who lacked. In the Victorian era, moral conviction was allied with self-discipline, respectability, and work. The self-help creed immortalized in Samuel Smiles's influential treatise is self-help spread like gospel among the middle class. Published in 1859, it argued that poverty was not merely a misfortune, but a consequence of irresponsibility and bad habits. Thrift, diligence, and character, Smiles emphasized, were the true engines of improvement and social standing. To those convinced by his words, those who failed to lift themselves out of misery had only their own failings to blame. This moral framework was reinforced by charitable organizations that promoted the idea that aid should be earned, not freely given. Groups like the Charity Organization Society, founded in 1869 by figures such as Helen Bosanquet and Octavia Hill, insisted on using scientific principles to root out scroungers and direct help only to the truly deserving in their eyes. Giving indiscriminately risked encouraging idleness, and worse, dependency. Charity was not an act of compassion, but a tool for enforcing moral rectitude. This ethos resonated with the broader currents of Victorian morality, evangelical piety, industrial discipline, personal improvement, and restraint became societal cornerstones. The working classes were expected to emulate the virtues of the more privileged, not in words but in deed. Yet when they failed, whether from sheer lack of opportunity or physical ailment, they were often met with suspicion. Their plight did not inspire empathy, but moral correction. Amid this climate, the question of why the poor suffered at all became almost taboo. Writers like Thomas Carlyle asked piercingly whether the condition of working people was benign enough to pass without complaint. Yet their queries tended to be spiritual in nature, not economic. Inquiry often stopped at the surface of individual responsibility. Systemic factors, such as industrial upheaval, agricultural displacement, or lopsided economic policy, were rarely acknowledged. When poverty did intrude upon public awareness, it was often through the lens of sensationalism or moral panic. Reports and novels detailed the immorality of slum dwellers or the criminal underbelly of urban chaos. Only rarely did they portray poverty as a product of social neglect. Reform-minded investigators like Charles Booth managed to dig deeper, using meticulous fieldwork to portray poverty as statistic and story alike. Booth's landmark late 1880 survey revealed that over a third of London's population lived in abject poverty, some even estimated at 35% in the East End. His work introduced the idea of a poverty line, illustrating not moral failure, but material insufficiency. Booth's findings challenged the dominant moral narrative by showing that poverty was too widespread to be a reflection of personal failure. But even with such evidence, society's response remained muted. Fear, indifference, and self-righteousness prevailed. Those with privilege framed poverty as unfortunate but necessary, a warning sign to the working poor to conduct themselves better, to rely not on society, but on their own inner resources. In literature, voices like Charles Dickens echoed this dissonance between wealth and responsibility. His stories laid bare the inhumanity of workhouses, the cruelty of casual wards, and the despair of those crushed by poverty. Yet in drawing attention to these institutions, Dickens also reminded readers that compassion should be universal, not tokenistic. By the end of the 19th century, the dissonance between moral idealism and reality could no longer be ignored. Evidence compiled by researchers and social reformers began to undermine the doctrine that poverty was solely a personal failing. Public health reforms and housing regulations emerged, not out of moral triumph, but necessity. The shuffle of urgency replaced the murmur of moral justification, even as society continued to cling to the notion that poverty needed correction more than cure. And so, Victorian society looked away until it could no longer do so. It did not see the poor as human. It saw them as warnings or objects of pity or moral puzzles. And perhaps it is only now, when we look back, that we can ask, what would we see if our own society chose to look again? In a city of shadows, smog, and relentless noise, a metropolis pulsing with industry and chaos, it was often the unseen voices of the poor that spoke the truest truths. In the grim and crowded alleyways of Victorian London, where the hungry beat their shivering hands against stone doorways and children hawked matches for a few pennies, there emerged a choir of witnesses. Their role was to listen, record, and deliver stories of suffering, resilience, and the human condition to a public that so often preferred to turn its gaze elsewhere. Henry Mayhew stands at the forefront of these chroniclers. In the late 1840s, a time marked by severe economic hardship known as the Hungry Forties, Mayhew embarked on a radical project to enter the streets of London, speak directly with the poor, and present their lives in vivid, unvarnished detail. His newspaper articles, later compiled into the multi-volume London Labour and the London Poor, captured an incredible range of street trades: rat-catchers, mudlarks, costermongers, pure, finders, and more, through interviews that revealed not merely their earnings and routines but their hopes, humor, fears. Mayhew's work didn't rationalize or romanticize. Rather, it insisted these people existed, worked, lived, and deserved to be heard. Mayhew's narrative did something remarkable. He refused to dismiss the poor as moral failures. Instead, he portrayed them as individuals with ingenuity, agency, and complexity. This perspective would deeply influence public perception and even literary visionaries, among them Charles Dickens. In their own ways, both men turned a mirror on society, forcing it to confront what it preferred to ignore. Dickens, already known for his empathetic storytelling, found in Mayhew's accounts a powerful impetus. His novels, with their vivid settings and unforgettable characters, painted the conditions of the urban poor with heartbreaking clarity. In Oliver Twist, he depicted the cruelty of the workhouse world, introducing the iconic image of young Oliver, bowl in hand, asking for more gruel. In Bleak House and Little Dorrit, he wove narratives that made compassion into a cry for justice, not just social charity, but fundamental reform. But it wasn't only the voices of writers that galvanized public sentiment. Investigative journalism and social mapping also played an essential role. Charles Booth's monumental study, Life and Labor of the People in London, included painstaking surveys and famously color-coded maps. These maps transformed abstract notions of poverty into stark visual truths, shading in each street according to the conditions of its residents. Booth's work revealed that in the capital, abject poverty was no aberration. It was widespread, complex, and urgent. Behind each record lay real lives. The narrators were not merely data points. Their existence, once hidden in plain sight, was now visible. The widows scrubbing laundry, the boys sweeping chimneys, the dust-laden hawkers navigating markets at dawn. Their stories began to populate newspapers, philanthropic tracts, and novels, chipping away at indifference. Alongside this rising conscience, philanthropic institutions took root. In 1820, the Society for the Relief of the Homeless Poor was established, one of London's earliest shelters, known for opening its doors at Western Lodge to hundreds during harsh winters. Decades later, Charles Dickens visited that asylum in Whitecross Street and recorded what he saw, saying that every face in which I could read, ragged and tired, dead beat, utterly destitute, houseless and hungry. In 1847, Dickens took that mission further by founding Urania Cottage with philanthropist Angela Burdett Coutts, a refuge intended to offer homeless women not only shelter, but training and a path toward dignified lives. These efforts, though limited in scale, were powerful testaments to human empathy. They tried to offer more than relief. They offered recognition, structure, and a possibility of transformation. They weren't perfect, and they were born from moral urgency rather than systemic overhaul, but they mattered. Philanthropy grew more embedded in London's social fabric as the 19th century progressed. Investigators, missionaries, and slummers from middle and upper classes ventured into the East End, not always out of noble intent, but often served as first-hand witnesses to what statistical data could only abstractly suggest. Some were driven by curiosity, others by conscience. Accounts they published began to shift public dialogue. pushing slums from being denigrated as dens of vice to recognized symbols of social failure that demanded attention by the 1880s and 1890s. Slumming, formerly a form of ill-advised entertainment, emerged as a powerful form of social investigation. Figures such as Lady Constance Battersea and even members of royalty like Princess Alice of Hesse, along with policy leaders like Lord Salisbury, spent time living among the poor to understand conditions firsthand. Their experiences, reported back to their circles, helped foster growing political will for urban reform. What happened in private journals slowly began to swell into public momentum. Literature, maps, interviews, philanthropic ventures, and statistical inquiries converged into a mosaic of empathy and information. People who had once been erased from the city's narrative began to matter again. Yet, despite these efforts, systemic change remained elusive. Reform was fragmented, slum clearances happened slowly, welfare legislation lagged behind need, and deeply ingrained moral judgments persisted. The Artisans' and Laborers' Dwellings Improvement Act of 1875 empowered local councils to demolish slum housing, but its impact was limited and uneven nevertheless. The echoes of reform reverberated into the 20th century. Foundation laid by Mayhew, Booth, Dickens, and others formed the ethical scaffold upon which the modern welfare state would eventually be constructed. And what of the voices themselves, the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable individuals whose names were rarely recorded? They were the true protagonists of this story. Their words, preserved through interviews, legal testimonies, shelter registers, and the notebooks of pens or tattered ledgers, remain some of the most powerful artifacts of Victorian compassion. They allowed London to hear its own heartbeat thumping through hopelessness, a pulse that would, in time, help shape a society less willing to ignore its most desperate members. In the end, the legacy of voices for the voiceless lies not in tidy legislation or grand statues, but in stories, imperfect, gritty human stories that demanded recognition. Through them, the faces in slum doorways acquired names, the destitute ceased to be statistics. The neglected became neighbors, and for a city defined by extremes, that shift in perception was the first step toward real change. By the close of the Victorian era, the smog and grime of London's industrial heart had stirred more than coughs, they stirred conscience. The city, once suffocating and indifferent, began to feel shifts in the air. These were not whispers of charity, but breaths of reform. Though gradually, unevenly, and often grudgingly, the machinery of change turned, from Acts of Parliament to shifting public sensibility, from sanitary boards to housing commissions, creaking the doors open just enough to let hope find a way in. One of the earliest embers of reform glowed in the work of men like Edwin Chadwick, who, haunted by the toll of disease and deplorable living conditions, argued that better public health was not only moral, but cost-effective. He insisted on clean water, proper sewage, refuse removal, and appointed medical officers for towns, all as means to prevent illness and reduce the burden on poor relief. His 1848 Public Health Act, imperfect though it was, represented the first legislative gesture toward organized urban hygiene. It created a central board of health, permitted local boards in high-death-rate areas, and unveiled a model that, despite limited funding and enforcement, pointed to the future. The equilibrium of Victorian laissez faire began to wobble further with the Public Health Act of 1875. This law gave real teeth to local authorities. Sewers and clean water became responsibilities, shady lodging houses required regulation, Every urban area needed a sanitary inspector and medical officer, and new dwellings had to include running water and internal drainage, transformations that altered the face of neighborhoods, one brick at a time. Towns were no longer free to ignore filth. Housing reform, though, remained sluggish. Slums proliferated, landlords skimped, and tenants suffered. By the early 20th century, such deplorable conditions could no longer be brushed aside. A Royal Commission on Housing of the Working Classes convened in 1903, drawing from medical professionals, government officials, clergy, even the Prince of Wales, to scrutinize the very bricks of deprivation. Its report, published the same year, offered a rare convergence of liberal and collectivist ideas: loans, subsidies, greater authority for local councils, even expropriation. It reframed housing not as market commodity, but public concern. The Housing, Town Planning, etc. Act of 1909 edged further away from crude block building. It banned back-to-back houses, introduced standards for new homes, and mandated proper town planning, a discipline balancing density, hygiene, and livability toward a modern urban vision. Legislation, however, was only half the story. The century's latter decades surged with social activism and documentation that hammered home the need for change. Reformers, writers, and visionaries, often middle class, descended into slums, laboratories, asylum wards, and factories, bearing witness. Their pens stained public awareness and policy alike. Investigations by men like Charles Booth, who mapped poverty in colorful precision, made abstract statistics painfully real. The upper classes could no longer ignore the inhabitants of alleys shaded in deep red and black. For the first time, their suffering had a visible address. Other reforms snowballed. Factory acts forbade child labor under 9, limited working hours for young women and children, imposed ventilation and machine safety. Each directive chipped away at exploitation and normalized state intervention in industrial life. Compulsory education, gradually expanded, emerged as a pathway out of endless labor. By 1880, children up to age 10 were required to learn to read, write, and count. Local government, too, took shape. Sanitary responsibilities centralized under the local government board as early as 1871, giving municipal reform a framework and, eventually, teeth. Expanded electoral franchise, especially at the municipal level, granted citizens, including some unmarried women, the right to vote on public health and housing policy, infusing local councils with new perspectives and priorities. This period also witnessed the diffusion of medical knowledge, germ theory, vaccines, antiseptic surgery, and their incremental application to public policy. Discoveries by Lister, Pasteur, Koch, Ross, and others reshaped the notion of disease from divine malady to scientific problem, with solutions that governments, not just families, could be made to enforce. The spread of parks, libraries, public parks, and museums, not only beautifying but normalizing accessible civic life, signaled a moral shift. The era was no longer just about correcting evils, it was about elevating public culture and inclusion. The pace of reform was uneven. Legislation often required local willingness and funding. Many poorer councils balked or moved too slow. But by century's end, a new contract between citizens and state had begun. The poor were no longer expected to must suffer or redeem themselves morally to deserve cleanliness, schooling, or shelter. Such benefits were increasingly seen as necessary components of a civilized society. In this way, the last decades of the Victorian era marked the shift from toleration of suffering to responsibility for welfare, from isolation of poverty to acknowledgement of systemic failings, from ad hoc charity to planned public institutions. From the assumption that poverty was moral failure to the understanding that it was a call to action. By 1901, when Queen Victoria passed away, Britain's political and urban fabric had been irreversibly altered. Framework for a modern welfare state, public health boards, housing standards, schooling for all, restrictions on exploitative labor, electoral representation was in place. Change had begun not with grand upheaval, but through steady, often contested reform. And though true welfare transformation lay still in the future, the boundary between the sufferer and the society that could comfort them had grown smaller, more permeable, more humane.